A lot of critics these days are asking whether globalization has begun to reverse and what the future might hold. There are also elaborate accounts of the achievements of globalization, and mostly in the past 20 or so years of its discontents. For those of you who study economics or finance, the man from this slide, former director of the World Bank, Joe Stiglitz, is perhaps very familiar, as he's been one of the most outspoken critics of globalization. But one thing that seems less central to current discussions has to do with the forces and processes that led us to this point in time, and with the social costs that all of us have paid over a long period of time, dating well before the past 20 years. These are the issues I had in mind when choosing the title for today's lecture: The Thorny Road to Globalization. As you can already see from this title, I'll argue that the path which has led us to this tremendously interconnected world has only been possible due to the great number of sacrifices that billions of people have had to make. The extreme version of these sacrifices has sometimes come in the form of a 7-day work week or long hours of physical labor. But you can also see it in terms of people's personal lives, which have been shaped by forces such as migration trends. My argument here is that the tremendous sacrifices that deepening globalization requires are now forced upon us by the social structures that we have built and by the material components that make up this interconnectivity that we've grown so used to. The changes which our social structures and their material components have undertaken have also been accompanied by a process of adaptation, both at the individual and at the social level. And this is a process of learning and adjusting, which appears to me to be a form of social evolution of sorts as well. In this lecture, we'll at times use the term creative destruction to describe this. Before I get into the main part of the lecture, I'll discuss different definitions of globalization and explain how I view the term for the purpose of our lecture today. This, as you can see from the subtitle of my lecture already, will be followed by 3 other sections. 2 of them focus on war and trade as forces which have sometimes promoted and even more often imposed globalization. It's very important to point out here that I'm using war as an umbrella term. I don't want to focus narrowly on the idea of armed conflict per se, but rather on a variety of processes that relate to military, strategic, or other forms of conquest or power projection which involve force or some form of conflict. Similar to my broad understanding of the term war, when I speak about trade, I'm referring to the term in the broad sense, in terms of economic exchanges, in terms of both forced and voluntary trade, and in terms of the economic implications that follow, in terms of the long-term outcomes of deepening economic globalization. Finally, the added focus on epidemics and pandemics is sort of a topical elaboration on the previous 2 sections. And it reveals the implications of deepening interconnectivity, the importance of the material base that underpins social structures, and the way that All of these things lead to the quote-unquote globalization of all sorts of issues and crises. Now, before I get into the first part of the lecture, it's very important to discuss two terms: globalization and Eurocentrism. There are dozens of definitions of globalization, and the main reason for this is that it is a complex phenomenon that can be legitimately seen and explored from various perspectives. Having large companies, for instance, make moves towards offshore production, might bring tremendous gains for a stockbroker here in Canary Wharf, while a factory worker up north in Newcastle loses their job, and a civil servant, perhaps in another smaller British town, might see neither gains nor losses from this process. Now, this is obviously an oversimplification, but even in this type of simple situation, you can already see that there is a difference in the way that globalization is understood by different social groups or by different economic classes. And this difference of perspectives exists both within the UK and within virtually any other country or region. So there is this element of divergence between definitions when globalization is explored. And then there is one more factor. If you are exploring definitions made by academics, they have different theoretical commitments and different backgrounds in terms of the region or the part of the world that they come from. Now, the word globalization itself, as we say it and spell it today, is relatively new. And it first appeared in a paper on education published in 1930. Then it became more popular in the social sciences during the 1960s and 70s. But it really entered mainstream discourse only when Levitt wrote about the globalization of markets, which has to do with the economic aspect of globalization and not with the cultural or with the other aspects of globalization. So it's important to point out that the term globalization is most often used in its economic sense, and it has sometimes been also appropriated by those who have an interest in allowing freer flows of capital across borders. From this perspective, some see globalization as a productive force that increases the scale and scope of international engagement. But there are also others who have felt that it is a repressive force which prevents them from moving forward and from getting rid of, for instance, the impact that the colonial period had on their societies. From a value-neutral perspective, globalization refers to a process of deeper international integration, but extended on a global scale. And this is the broad understanding of the term that I'll adopt when discussing the concept today. So I'll be focusing on the global aspect of the phenomenon. And this is particularly important because, as many have rightly noted, globalization includes a significant element of compressing time and space. Now, there has been, of course, a process of international integration and exchange going on for thousands of years, way before the concept of globalization and many other older concepts like the nation state emerged. But until a few hundred years ago, this process of integration was more regional than global, with occasional trade between distant peoples, but without any significant direct contact between them at the mass level. Now, this began to changed profoundly in 1492. As you'll likely remember from studying history, this was the year when Columbus sailed the ocean to reach the Americas. And it led to two profound changes that I'd like to focus on. First, this event was the beginning of a process that resulted in the ultimate creation of a world map. So this was the beginning of conceptualizing the world as one complex, interconnected entity. And second, from this point on, Europeans began to significantly increase their deployment of military force and to use other tactics to advance their business and political interests globally. Now, this is not a starting point that everyone agrees with. And this is so particularly because of a rising trend in academia to challenge what has been termed Eurocentrism. The concept of Eurocentrism refers to the tendency to put Europe at the heart of one's viewpoint, seeing the whole world from the perspective of European thought, European geography, and European norms. Even looking at commonly used geographic terms such as, for example, the Middle East, to refer to what is objectively Western Asia, reveals how pervasive this trend is. And the problem that comes with it is that this often prevents us from understanding different viewpoints, including various cultures, priorities, and interests that are at play in the wider world. Like many of my colleagues in London, I think that the idea of Eurocentrism is objectively pointing us to a barrier that is preventing academics and students from understanding the complexities which shape our world. But having said that, I'm also skeptical that the history of the past 528 years of globalization can be told without recognizing the profound impact that Europe and later the US have had on the world. So the 2 points that I want to make here are, first, that some might see my starting point of 1492 as Eurocentric, and they might have very good reasons for that. And second, that I'm well aware of this, but it seems to me that in this particular instance of assessing globalization, it is both somewhat accurate and both certainly useful to take Columbus's voyage as a starting point. Now, with these disclaimers in mind, let's dig into the first main section of the lecture, exploring the relationship between war, or more specifically, aggressive strategic conquest, and globalization. The big question here is, why and how did Europe make advancements that led to the global dominance of a few small powers? And this question is twofold. The first part of it is, what drove the exploratory missions that led to establishing contact with the Americas and pursuing more intensive contact with other regions as well? And the second part is, what led to Europe's success in those interactions? So let's start with the first part. Why were the Europeans so eager to explore and engage with the rest of the world? Well, European powers, for one, were certainly not much more advanced than others when they began to explore the world more intensively. Before the 15th century, we had great Asian empires that were often as rich and powerful, and sometimes richer and more powerful than the people occupying the lands of the British or the French. The Ottomans built one of the most formidable empires in the Near East, and in many ways they also had a more diverse and more progressive society than that of certain parts of Europe at the time. The Ming and the Manchu Qing in China were clearly rich enough to afford expeditions and to pursue global exploration, and they also had the ships to do so, as we know from accounts of Zheng He's voyages to Africa. And yet these empires didn't pursue globalization and didn't expand their control out of their neighboring regions. There are various theories exploring the question why, many of which focus on certain internal reasons. Some argue that domestic politics was a priority for these empires at the time, so the elites there did not deem it necessary to allocate resources to things like elaborate expeditions. Others suggest that there were cultural reasons, for example, people's general lack of desire to leave their own land and seek new places to explore. And this was, of course, remember, in the context of agricultural societies where everyone's life was deeply interconnected with the land around them. The extent to which these reasons played a role is really any historian's guess. But one factor that seems indispensable in enabling the provision of funding to Columbus and to other European explorers as well was the fact that within Europe, states created intra-regional pressure, internal pressure within Europe as a continent on other states, because they waged a lot of wars at the time. So let's examine the context of where it all started, which is the history of Spanish exploration, and that, of course, begins with the history of Spain itself. After the 700s, much of Spain fell under Islamic rule, and in the 15th century there was an ongoing process known as the Reconquista, which refers to the push for establishing Spain as a Catholic power. So first we had the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469, which unified Catholic Spain. Then Ferdinand and Isabella figured out that Portuguese explorers had reached the southern tip of Africa and that they would soon reach Asia. So this meant that in the 15th century, we now had for the first time a unified Spain, and it was also racing for overseas exploration and power with Portugal. So this was a profound structural reconfiguration on the Iberian Peninsula. So in this context, Columbus came, and he was originally Italian. First, he approached a number of monarchs across Europe, including the English, the Portuguese, and a number of others to ask for funding. He was, of course, seeking an alternative route to India through the Atlantic Ocean. And he was sort of in the middle of a quote-unquote sort of Game of Thrones within Europe. So Spain simply took a gamble and invested in his idea. So Columbus went off and reached an island, which is present-day Haiti, but he thought initially that this was the East Indies. So he called the locals Indios, which gave rise to the term Indians that we still use today to refer to some indigenous populations in the Americas. And he also named the land Isola Española, which he sort of tried to create a map for as well, as you can see on this slide. In fact, even the broader term America that we use today to refer to two vast continents comes from the name of another explorer, Amerigo Vespucci. And there is an important reason why I'm pointing to this historical reminders, because there are two lessons that this illustrates. First, Columbus's story tells us about the role of intra-regional rivalries in terms of providing motivation for Europeans to explore the world. If Spain was not in a rivalry with Portugal, maybe Columbus's voyage would have never been financed. And then you had the effects that reveal how prevalent Eurocentrism became, even in the way that it shaped names, in the way that it shaped the language, and certain concepts that we still use today to refer to certain groups of people or to certain places. Now, the other important question here is, why were Europeans so successful in imposing their will, or rather their dominance, across the world? Well, for many decades, the main concept that academics employed to explain this was the so-called military revolution. And you can see it in the so-called classics of social sciences, including the works of Montesquieu, John Stuart Mill, and Adam Smith. But it's perhaps better illustrated by a military historian called Michael Roberts, who attributes European success to particular achievements in 4 areas: tactics, strategy, army size, and state development. Now, Roberts would argue, for instance, that Europe's military dominance stemmed from things like linear battlefield formations and strategic adjustments, such as the use of multiple armed groups which seek to achieve a common goal, a single goal. And then you have other historians, such as Jeffrey Parker, who emphasize guns and fortifications. But in any case, the point here is that there was clearly more investment in armies and more organization from the European side, at least when it comes to professional armies, as we call them today. And many historians believed for many decades that this had to do with the reasons behind Europe's global dominance. Now, this story might sound like it makes sense, but exploring particular engagements between European powers and other empires in the so-called New World suggests otherwise. There are entire books which have recently come out to refute the idea that the military revolution led to global dominance. One of them is Sharman's very short, but I'd say insightful Empires of the Week, where he makes a very well-put argument. So Sharman argues, rightly in my view, that much of Europe's success came from the fact that it was able to first maintain control over major routes, which at the time were maritime trade routes, And second, enter into well-thought strategic negotiations or deals of different sorts with local leaders, looking for ways to control and exploit local populations through them. I won't focus on Sharman's argument in any particular detail here because that would take quite some time, but I'll try to illustrate this point by telling you about the way that Hernán Cortes, one of the early explorers who came after Columbus, managed to undermine the great Aztec Mexica Empire. So Cortes arrived on the island that Columbus had discovered, that is the Hispaniola, in 1504, and then he moved on to explore the Yucatan Peninsula, which is in modern-day Mexico. Then in 1519, he got to Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Mexica Empire. And like all Europeans who saw this quote-unquote new world, Cortes was really fascinated with the wealth that the Aztecs had in gold. And he started devising a plan to take over the city. So to do that, he took its ruler, Montezuma, hostage. And this angered the people of Tenochtitlan, who obviously rose up against him, and then he had to flee with his people. But there is a caveat here. Like any other government, the Aztec one was not popular among old people, and there were, of course, some who resented it. So what Cortes decided to do was not to attempt battling the Aztec Empire directly in some sort of combat, but instead to make alliances with some of those who were not happy with the people in power. And there was one group in particular, the Tlaxcaltecas, who provided as many as 200,000 fighters that helped Cortes in the siege of Tenochtitlan. When these locals accompanied Cortes in the battle, they thought they were making an equal partnership with him. And to be fair, they did receive lots of land and other benefits after the battle was won. But from a Spanish perspective, they were aids and nothing else. Like the story of Columbus, that of Cortes teaches us a very important lesson. And it's that the Europeans didn't simply come in with some sort of astonishing weapons that could just wipe out local forces easily. They didn't have the manpower either, because you can't bring that many people over on ships. So the Europeans were actually bound to suffer defeats if they tried to simply come and fight. This is, of course, not unexpected, given that Europeans were entering enemy territory, clearly with less manpower than any local forces could have had. So, what does this story show? Why is this important? Well, first, this is one of many instances that reveals that the global dominance of the Europeans was not necessarily decided by some sort of advantage in terms of weaponry, at least in their first stage of conquests. And second, it shows that although there is no doubt European powers had strong and disciplined standing armies and knew a lot about traditional warfare, this was not necessarily applicable to battles fought in Latin America, Africa, or Asia. And third, Europeans used a variety of tactics that were centered around making strategic alliances with local leaders and employing them in order to overthrow existing power structures. Now, at this point, it's very likely that some of you are listening to all of this and thinking, well, Ivo, that's great, very interesting, but what does it have to do with globalization? What does it have to do with our research and our essays? Why are you telling us about Cortes and his strategy to fight the Aztecs when most of us are researching contemporary issues? Well, there are a few reasons for this. And the first one is to make you think about the context, the backdrop in which our modern world developed, and the processes that led us to where we are. And the second one is that it might be wise of you to think for a minute whether the way in which globalization is often imposed on people is much different today than the way it was 500 years ago when European powers claimed to discover new parts of the world. If we look at the means used by the US to maintain its global dominance by engaging with the world on its own terms, there are plenty of similarities to the earlier days of European empires. For one, let's look at this map of US military bases. And you could also especially think about Navy bases and their significance in securing sea transport, logistics, and trade routes. Something we'll talk about more later as well. It's also no secret that the US engages actively with political elites abroad and works hard to make sure that there are many people in office around the world who are aligned in terms of their worldview with the US. And they're often educated in the US or advised by US educated consultants. In terms of direct involvement, there is a tremendous number of cases, for example, best documented, I think, in Latin America, where the US has backed the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, in Chile, or the government of Alberto Fujimori in Peru, and many others throughout the decades. And there is as well a tremendous number of proxy wars, mostly in the Middle East, but also some in other places like North Africa, like Central Africa, where we see various pro and anti-government forces supported by great powers, including the US and Russia, but also other great and even middle powers. Now, none of this comes independent of globalization. In fact, it seems to me very much driven by the same forces that contributed to the rapid speed of international integration through enforcing it upon much of the world. It's therefore impossible to separate the history of globalization from the history of empires that seek to strategically project their power on the rest of the world. And all of this has had tremendous social costs for millions and millions, and these days even billions, I would say, of people. When I say this, I'm not only referring to humanitarian costs, although they are clearly vastly important, but also to the fact that a certain world order and a certain necessity to engage has been disrupting the lives of many people. And this has been happening in a way at least since 1492. There are various effects that this has had on different peoples, from effectively wiping out rich traditions and culture to forcing people into slavery, or more recently into simply bad working conditions, for the benefit of certain companies or certain governments. Or even worse, this might also often be for the direct benefit of local leaders who might strike a deal with imperial powers and then sell out their own people in exchange for a comfortable life, just as an elite intermediary of sorts, bringing global power projection to their own local communities. So, was globalization inevitable? And what is its relationship to empires? And who's at fault for the issues that arise from globalization or for the problems faced by local people? Can you separate great empires from local leaders? And do the systems of governance, often labeled as democratic, serve as any viable alternatives given the geopolitical context in which they operate? I encourage you to consider these questions in terms of the context of war and conquest and globalization that we've had and we've discussed so far. And in terms of the next part of my talk, I'll shift my focus on trade. Now, so far we've established that European powers put themselves in a position to draft the rules of the first phase of globalization, which means that they set up the early system of world trade during the colonial period. This system was underpinned by the trade philosophy of mercantilism, which is based on one core assumption, that the wealth which exists in the world is limited. Now, this is because back in the day, wealth was measured in gold and silver. So European powers believed that states, or rather empires at the time, should control trade in order to create wealth. Mercantilists argued against allowing their nations to trade freely with others, and this includes colonial territories. So, in reality, this means that colonies had to send their raw materials back to their so-called mother country, which would then send back, or rather sell back, finished goods such as tools or clothing. Meanwhile, of course, the colonists and their subjects were forbidden to trade with other colonial territories or other nations. One obvious effect of this was the blunt exploitation of people and natural resources for the benefit of the elites of small European nations. But there was another effect that was less obvious and more persistent, even in the area of perhaps not exactly free, but at least recently much freer trade. This effect is the division of labor between former colonies as producers of local cheaper labor or raw materials vis-a-vis Europe, which provided and continues to provide much higher value added goods. And the problem here is both theoretical and practical. So let me explore the theoretical part first. For anyone who's done economics before, it's perhaps no news that there are many models, such as the Ricardian one, which claim to reveal the overall benefit that free trade can bring. For those of you that come from other disciplines, the simple version of the story is that if we have two countries and one of them is better at producing product A, for example, coffee, and the other one is better at producing product B, for example, computers, then they should both specialize in what they do best and simply trade with each other. This sounds great in theory, but there are quite a few problems in practice. First, the value of these products is not equal when we consider that one country consistently produces raw materials which are cheap and only sell with little value added, while the other consistently exports high value added products and services. The margins that you make from selling things like coffee beans, even if you make the very best coffee beans, can't compare to the margins that you can make from exporting, for instance, laptops, or let alone pure services such as education. If you try to pay your Queen Mary fees with money made from selling coffee beans, you'll have much more trouble than people who are working in, for instance, banking or the IT sector. The other problem is that this discrepancy is not just between people, but also between entire countries, and that it continues on a consistent basis over time. So when free trade was pronounced as a universal, I guess you could say, value of sorts, or at least as a pursuit by dominant empires, which were moving away from the colonial model, these same empires had at the time a well-established infrastructure that would allow them to consistently maintain their position as owners of more valuable industries. And this produced a structural barrier for less developed countries to catch up over time. Now, don't get me wrong, these less developed countries are still making gains in absolute terms, but it's completely unclear how and when they would actually be able to close the gap. This is because there are various obstacles along the way, such as the middle income trap. There sometimes comes a point where developing countries cannot continue the process of moving from low value added to high value added industries. Remember that their comparative advantages, such as low cost labor and imitation of foreign technology, can simply disappear when middle and upper middle income levels are reached. Actually, we might in reality not even get there, not even get to the middle income trap for many countries, because if automation continues to spread around, that might kill off the advantage of lower labor costs to begin with. And all of these problems are structural features of the way our international economic system works. Throughout the decades, these and other issues have been explored by various critical scholars through the development of approaches such as dependency theory, which sought to identify the root issue of the lack of development in Latin America. And you also have world systems theory, which argues that there is a three-level hierarchy consisting of core, peripheral, and semi-peripheral states. Now, according to world systems theory, core countries dominate and exploit peripheral countries for labor and raw materials, while peripheral countries are dependent on core countries for capital. In essence, this is a simplified model that attempts to explain the socioeconomic structure of global inequality, and it illustrates the divisions of labor that prevent certain countries from moving further up the economic cycle. Now, of course, there are various ways around it. For instance, the way that South Korea subsidized high-tech companies in the mid to late 20th century until they developed to become competitive. This was a great strategy that ended up working well to overcome this problem. And South Korea has clearly turned into a highly developed country. That happened only in a matter of decades. To a certain extent, what's happening in China today is not much different. It's a form of government-directed policy through subsidies and various incentives to push the country's economic development higher up the value chain. So keep in mind that no single theory can really encapsulate the complexities that underpin structural economic inequalities. And neither dependency theory nor world systems theory in particular have a large number of proponents today, but they used to be very influential, and the issue is that structural inequalities exist regardless of what you think of these theories, and these structural inequalities are very hard to overcome, and they often have plenty of costs for countries and for their people. Even when a transition from lower end to higher end products and services is successful, there are entire generations that pay the price for this because they end up being, for example, incentivized to do certain jobs that are important from a strategic perspective instead of pursuing their own interests. Now, from a purely historical perspective, the process of decolonization, which took place in the past 100 or so years, did not end exploitative relationships either. So, in the early days of newly formed independent countries, formerly exploitative relationships took the form of new preferential trade links with former empires. So concepts such as Eurafrica and new colonialism emerged to denote this. But even without setting this preferential treatment at the government level, it's just inherent in the nature of what is produced in developing countries and what is demanded in developed countries through market mechanisms. Now, at this point, many of you might think that I've perhaps been overly critical of economic globalization. And perhaps I have. So it's also very important to note that many proponents of globalization make valid points in terms of its achievements. At the global level, it has reduced extreme poverty by a remarkable margin. So in 1990, the number of people below the UN poverty line was about 1.8, 1.9 billion globally. While today this figure has fallen down to about 730 million if we look at the latest data. There are various daily conveniences that globalization has brought about as well, including the devices that you're using to watch this lecture, as well as others such as faster and more efficient transport links. But getting, or the process of getting to a point where we reap the benefits of globalization has been wildly disruptive for the lives of billions as well. There are many people in peripheral countries who are simply sitting and often watching the world moving on as globalization just passes them by. Young and talented people have often moved out of these places and into more developed ones, often in Europe or in the US, pursuing a better life for themselves or for their families. So this is a multidimensional phenomenon. You might see a brain drain for some countries or regions and a gain for others. But at the same time, you see many debates about things like the influx of migrants in many developed countries. So nationalist movements, for instance, led by Marine Le Pen in France, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Brexit, the Trump campaign, all of these phenomena are not simply ideational movements of some sort. They have an economic basis as well. And this economic basis is that the benefits of globalization have been distributed in a very unequal manner between countries and also within countries, between different social groups and economic classes. To understand why and how, let's look at this great chart, which tracks income distribution on a global level from 1988 to 2008. So on the left-hand side, on the vertical, you see gains in real income measured in percentage terms, and across the horizontal axis, you see world population mapped out from the poorest to the richest groups of people in the world. Now let me give you an example of how reading this chart works. So if we want to know how much the richest people in the world gained in terms of a percentage increase, then we have to look at the right hand side of the chart. You can see that the real income of the top 1% has grown by about 65%. But let's look at other groups as well. Who's below the top 1%? Well, you see the 80th percentile here, about the 70th, 80th, 90th percentile. This is the middle class of developed countries, and they're very high up on the chart to begin with. Because remember, even the middle class in the US or Western Europe is, in absolute terms, much wealthier than most people in the world. So on average, you see that the income of the middle class in places like the US and Western Europe has been stagnant for decades. And this has angered a lot of people, especially considering that they were promised that globalization would bring them huge benefits. So first, their income hasn't grown. And second, they've watched the entire world around them, both the wealthier and the less wealthy, make faster progress. And on top of this, there's a sense that these people have been lied to as well, or at least misled by economic elites. When you combine these things, it becomes much clearer why the working class in developing countries has grown increasingly dissatisfied with globalization. Because the benefits of this process have been distributed mostly to the wealthier class in developed countries, and to some parts of the population in developing ones, which you can see around the 50th, the 60th percentile, right in the middle. The middle of this chart there stands for places like China and India as well, and other big winners of globalization, where you see this emerging middle class. And all of this is, of course, not the fault of the middle class in the US or of France. Instead, it's the result of optimizing production processes through things like outsourcing, which has sought cheaper labor either through automation or through setting up factories in developing countries, and it's ensured greater market gains. But this has left out the middle class in Western Europe and the US. Now let's look at the rest of the graph as well. What about the far left at the bottom of global income distribution? Let's not forget about these people. They're people who live in countries that are often too remote or too violent or too unpredictable to become integrated into global supply chains, because not many people want to invest there. So there's a lot of people there who are completely left out, and in a way they're almost outside of the global economy. So overall, what this graph shows is that the distribution of income increases that different groups have seen from globalization has been unequal in various ways within countries, between countries. There are tremendous inequalities that globalization has led to within a very short period of time. Now, those of you who have been paying close attention to the talk so far might have noticed that it's presented to you arguments that might seem somewhat contradictory, at least at first glance. First, when we spoke about the global economy in terms of exploitative trade between the core and the periphery, and we spoke also about the social costs of globalization, specifically in developing countries. Then we saw this graph, this elephant graph, which reveals that despite inequalities caused by globalization, there are various large groups of people whose real income has increased. But then at the same time, we spoke also about social costs for developed countries, and by this point, all of these things might seem like they're just incoherent when you put them together. But this is not a mistake on my part. It's actually a reflection of different phenomena that have happened at the same time. So I made a deliberate decision to touch on them, and there are a few different lessons to be drawn here. The first one is that economic globalization is sort of a magic mirror. This means that there's plenty of evidence for a variety of arguments, and people often claim to see whatever they're comfortable with. Different people often choose to focus on certain parts of globalization that suit their goals or purposes, or perhaps their beliefs and morals, or sometimes even lack thereof. The second lesson here is that the process of going through economic globalization has had high social costs for various groups of people at different points in time. Sometimes it has caused issues for the working class in developing countries, and sometimes it's caused other issues for the working class in developed ones. But one very important point that I would argue here is that no matter how you view this issue, the root cause of these inequalities lies in our economic structure. They simply come about because of the way that our markets, our governments, our social values, all of these structural elements provide incentives for the distribution or redistribution of material capabilities or resources in ways that tend to be unequal. So this has great social costs across various dimensions. And the final lesson that I would draw from this is that we're witnessing a process that can be well encapsulated in a reinterpretation of Joseph Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction. He defined this as the process of industrial mutation that continuously revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. If you think about globalization, there are these constant social costs that people have to pay simply through adjusting to changing realities. But at the same time, this leads to new forms of engagement with the economy through various means, such as upgrading technology or relocating production processes. In fact, what's most likely coming ahead might well be a classic example of creative destruction. And if we look at the near future, this will come in the form of automation, which is developing very rapidly, and it's likely to continue developing even quicker than it already has, meaning those who work in manufacturing will simply be forced to requalify, or unfortunately in some instances perhaps left behind. So that's bad news for global factories in developing countries, in fact. But at the same time, there will be tremendous new incentives for business owners and capitalists to increase their gains, and the possibility for future generations to work jobs that involve less repetitive tasks. So the transformation essentially continues. On this note, if I can give you any advice here, I think it would be wise of you to think about the wealth distribution graph we explored earlier, and to try to predict how global inequalities will shift when automation processes progress further. What countries will benefit from this, and which social groups within these countries are best positioned to make greater gains? The answers to these types of questions will have a profound implication for social developments around the world in the coming years and even decades. Now, I've promised you one final section, which is about epidemics, pandemics, and globalization. And before we start, there is an important distinction to make in terms of definitions. So there are two terms, epidemic and pandemic. And in our daily life, we often use them interchangeably, but in fact, they have two different meanings. An epidemic is the outbreak of a disease in a community, while a pandemic is the outbreak of a disease globally. So it's good just to keep this in mind. This part of the talk is shorter, but it covers issues which are very topical given the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And the main point here will be that the gradual development of trade links and structures has meant that the movement of goods, services, and people also leads to the quick spread of global crises, whether they might be environmental ones or health ones or economic ones. What we witnessed in the past few months was essentially the spread of a pandemic across major economic hubs and routes. So let me briefly elaborate on this. Now, the COVID-19 virus that we see spreading today is new, but the phenomenon of pandemics is, of course, very old. And when we spoke about the early arrivals of the Europeans in Latin America, in fact, one element that we left out there was that the Europeans carried over, unintentionally, very often, of course, various diseases that local populations were not used to, and this took a great toll. So this was in the form of various epidemics, of course, that emerged within newly quote-unquote discovered regions, and they shaped the course of development, or rather lack thereof, in certain ways. Now, thinking about the global scope of pandemics, perhaps the two deadliest ones in history have been Justinian's plague, which has nothing to do with Justinian per se, but it happened during his time when he was in charge of the Byzantine Empire. And then, of course, the Black Death, which we've all learned at school about. And then More recently, we've had many other more minor ones in the past 150 years or so. We've had, for instance, the so-called Russian flu in 1889 to 90, which killed at least 1 million people and probably more. Then we had the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. This probably came from Kansas in the US, not from Spain. But Spain was the first country that publicized it because it wasn't as concerned about showing a weakness during the First World War, so that's why it was named Spanish flu after the country that publicized it for the first time. And that was a big pandemic that killed at least 50 million people worldwide, from what we know. It may have actually killed a lot more, but we can't be sure of that because the bulk of deaths took place in parts of the world like Africa or Latin America or South Asia, where the record keeping, especially at the time, for obvious reasons, wasn't very good. And then a big outbreak in the mid 20th century in 1957-58 was the Central Asian flu, which killed 2 to 5 million people, and then in 68-69 the so-called Hong Kong flu, which carried away 1 to 4 million people. So the point here is that epidemics and pandemics take place occasionally, and this has continued, and it will continue in modern history. You see here as well more recent ones like SARS, Ebola, of course COVID-19. So whenever you're dealing with a virus, there are two important pieces of information to look at: how infectious it is and how deadly it is. So the more lethal the disease, the less likely it is to spread. This was illustrated very clearly during the SARS virus outbreak, especially in East Asia. It had very high death rates there, killing between 20 and 30% of the people who caught it. So this meant that it couldn't spread too far or too fast. But another factor that influences the spread of a virus significantly is the extent to which a certain city, a certain area, or a certain region is interconnected with the world. So if you look at the places which are hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic, it's no surprise that they are globally connected cities, including Madrid, Milan, New York, with a lot of traffic passing through these cities. Now, if we look at the spread of pandemics, both prior to and after the period of rapidly deepening economic globalization, we'll notice that it followed certain trade routes. So let's start by looking at Justinian's plague, which took place a very long time ago in 541, 542 AD. You'll see this is the Byzantine Empire at the time of the plague, and the arrows are the routes, the directions that the plague took. And then the dotted lines are the second wave, and you'll notice how it spreads out of Constantinople, which is, of course, it used to be this mega city that many people passed through. And it spread all around the Mediterranean in a matter of just about a year and a half or so. And then on the next slide here, you have the Spanish flu, which took place much more recently. So the initial documented outbreak, as I told you, was in Kansas in the US, and then it spread to Europe and to other parts of the world. Only 6 months after it was first detected in the US, the virus got to Paris. And as you saw yourselves earlier this year, the COVID-19 pandemic spread on a global scale very, very, very quickly. And we saw this unfolding live in front of our eyes, and it was also televised to a certain extent. And this is just another point that illustrates the costs of deepening international integration. Any sort of issue or disaster that can be carried around and spread around now affects the whole world rather than one country or one region. Justinian's plague could have never reached Latin America or Australia, but COVID-19 can do that very quickly. Now, seeing this unfold on a global scale leads to other effects, and it changes the way that governments and businesses think about economics. In fact, in the coming 1 or 2 years, it's very likely to see an accelerated movement away from free markets. For many countries, the center-right of politics is going to move much more towards interventionist economic nationalism, combined with a kind of private but in some ways state-directed economy. So the globalization of crises and responses that follow, the social tension that comes with all of this, all of these things now have a global dimension. But this is not limited to pandemics. We've already seen that it's the same thing, for instance, when it comes to environmental problems. Regardless of your views on climate change and green deals, it's easy to see, for example, that mass pollution can have global implications. If you think of financial markets, it's the same story that we've seen with the global financial crisis, which seems to have started as a subprime mortgage crisis in the US in 2007, but because markets are interconnected, that led to a global financial crisis in 2008 and continued up to 2010. So when you think about the way that pandemics spread around, keep in mind that local problems can now very quickly become global ones. And it will be useful to you to think of this as one of the many dimensions that underpin the social costs that come along with globalization. By now, we already know that the next time we see a pandemic or a financial crisis or a breakdown in global supply chains or any other phenomenon or crisis of this type, there will be global implications. They might vary depending on the extent that we take precautions to exert some degree of self-reliance, but nobody is really self-reliant anymore. So to use economic terms, we're no longer in a world of autarky, but instead in a world of interconnectivity. And we're forced to face these challenges that globalization brings. So this leads me to my broader conclusion. But before I get there, let me summarize the main points of each section. And they have to do with war, trade, and pandemics. So first, we explored ways in which great powers have imposed globalization on others throughout history. Motivated by power rivalries, they were eager to expand their influence abroad. So to do that, they sent various, you could say, missions and ensured that they controlled trade routes, especially maritime ones, and befriended local elites so that they would employ these relationships with these elites in order to control people in various territories. And throughout this process, they gained various benefits such as preferential trade treatment, cheap labor, and geopolitical influence. So In other words, the role of empires in promoting globalization through rather crude means has been enormous. And the social costs have been paid by people who used to live in colonial territories and today live primarily in developing countries. Then we looked at trade and economic globalization, which has certain achievements, such as the reduction of global poverty, but meanwhile has great social costs as well. And in the end, we drew three conclusions there. First, that economic globalization is in many ways like a magic mirror, meaning that there is enough evidence to present or sort of repurpose globalization from whatever angle suits you or the speaker. The second conclusion that we drew was that the social costs of globalization have been paid by different groups of people in both developing and developed countries. And these social costs differ depending on the time period and the economic class that you might choose to focus on. And the third conclusion here is that these costs that society pays as sort of a quote-unquote tax on globalization often lead to the creation of adjustments in the economic system through change and innovation and adaptation. So this makes the process somewhat resemble Schumpeter's creative destruction. And finally, in our brief review of pandemics in globalization, we concluded that interconnectivity has led to a significant increase in the speed at which crises of all sorts, including health, environmental, and financial ones, spread around the world. Now, having drawn these conclusions, let me get back to the title of the lecture and the main argument that underpins it. As exciting as the road to globalization is, it is also thorny, and it has been very thorny. There are plenty of social costs we have to pay as a price to obtain the benefits that come along with greater interconnectivity. And there is something that is sometimes not a matter of voluntary participation. Today, globalization, as well as these forces that impose it on the world, are entrenched in the structures that surround us. And these are sometimes social structures and sometimes material structures. So they're not simply some sort of ideas. They're now backed by a structure also in the material sense of the world. The materials that are used to produce goods are shipped from one place to another. The planes that are flying every day back and forth, they're physical. All of these are material elements of this structure. And all sorts of other elements in the world around us are now an encapsulation of these social and material globalized structures. Even the digital infrastructure that surrounds us has a strong material aspect today. So globalization has changed the physicality of the world that surrounds us. And in the process, we have adapted and readapted many times. And altogether, this could be termed, from an economic perspective, creative destruction, or even in biological terms, as social evolution. So I hope that this lecture has given you a broader perspective on some of the forces that are at play during processes of globalization, and I hope that you found it somewhat useful as a bank of ideas that you might agree or disagree with, but can ultimately help you to frame or reframe your research on that basis. So thank you very much for listening. Stay safe for the remainder of the COVID-19 pandemic, which will hopefully end very, very shortly. And I hope to see you soon in person at Queen Mary, at University of London, at our Mile End campus.